It didn't begin with chaos. It didn't begin with noise. It began with a door, one that closed so slowly, so quietly, that by the time we noticed it was shut, we had already accepted the room it left us in. For a long time, we believed that silence was a sanctuary. That solitude was something we owned, a choice, a retreat. But what if the silence we now sit in wasn't ours to begin with? In a world louder than ever, with voices echoing from every device, every screen, every corner of our lives, something strange is happening. People feel alone, not occasionally, but chronically, especially those who crave peace, especially those who observe instead of perform, especially the quiet ones. We tell ourselves it's the price of being different. That some people simply prefer solitude. But the feeling isn't peaceful. It's a disconnection, and that disconnection isn't always a symptom. Sometimes it's the goal. Erich Fromm once warned of this exact paradox, a society that promises freedom, yet manufactures alienation. A system that tells you to be yourself, but quietly punishes those who do. He called it the pathology of normalcy, a state where people function well enough to obey, but not deeply enough to rebel. Where alienation becomes so normalized, you stop questioning it. So, what if the modern introvert isn't simply retreating? What if they're being exiled, systematically, gently, permanently, because solitude, in its true form, is dangerous. Solitude is where people remember who they are. Solitude is where empires are questioned. Solitude is where revolutions begin, not with guns, but with thoughts, and thoughts are a threat. Hannah Arendt, one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century, understood this better than most. She wrote that loneliness was the breeding ground of totalitarianism. Not loud, dramatic loneliness, but quiet, private, hopeless loneliness, the kind that leaves you too isolated to resist and too numb to care. It's not hard to see the shape of this today. In the age of hyperconnectivity, we are more watched than ever, yet rarely seen. We are more stimulated than ever, yet emotionally undernourished. Social media pretends to connect us, but it gives us mirrors, not windows. Algorithms don't nurture depth, they mimic it. They sedate you with tailored distraction until solitude feels empty, until you fear your own mind. And that fear is precisely the point, because once you fear being alone, you'll run from your own power. Once you've been conditioned to believe that silence means insignificance, you'll give up the one thing that made you dangerous to begin with, your inner world. The question isn't just, why are so many introverts withdrawing? The question is, what are they withdrawing from, and who benefits from their silence? It is no coincidence that the most reflective minds are the ones most often labeled as strange, difficult, or antisocial. Society doesn't fear the loud. It knows how to distract them. It fears the quiet, because the quiet ones listen. And worse, they remember. What we call opting out may, in truth, be a slow slide into submission. Not because the introvert surrendered, but because the system made the silence feel safe and resistance feels exhausting. So here we are, alone, together. Connected but untouched, surrounded but unseen, and the door that once opened to peace now locks quietly behind us. But a locked door can still be opened, if you remember that it ever closed at all. At first, it just seemed like a mismatch. A world built for extroverts, where the louder voice won the room and the fastest answer won the grade. Where being still was mistaken for being absent, and thinking quietly was confused with not thinking at all. But this wasn't an accident. It was architecture. From our earliest years, we're placed into systems that reward energy, performance, enthusiasm, not depth. Classrooms where participation is measured by how often you speak, not by what you've truly absorbed. offices that equate collaboration with constant visibility, social lives that orbit around noise, motion, presence, and those who thrive in silence, who reflect before they speak, who prefer focus over frenzy, are labeled in small, quiet ways: shy, uncooperative, difficult, too sensitive, too serious. Every label becomes a brick, every expectation a wall, until one day you're not just quiet, you're isolated. Susan Cain, in her study of cultural temperament, called it the extrovert ideal, a value system that elevates charisma over character, volume over vision. A system where the ability to dominate a conversation is seen as leadership and solitude is mistaken for weakness. And when society worships the loud, the reflective are not just excluded, they are reprogrammed. Not by force, but by praise, by applause for the wrong things, and punishment for the right ones. This is where Foucault's panopticon enters the picture, a prison design where inmates never know when they're being watched, so they behave as if they always are. The genius of the panopticon wasn't surveillance, it was self-surveillance. Compliance became internal. Freedom became theater. Today, we don't need physical towers. We've built psychological ones. We monitor our own expressions. We rehearse our responses. We edit our personalities, frame by frame, to match the dominant current. And what's most chilling is this: it doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like fitting in. The introvert doesn't rebel against this system. They withdraw. Not because they lack courage, but because the cost of pretending is too high. But withdrawal isn't escape. Not when the system follows you into your solitude. Not when it brands your silence as failure. Not when every step back is read as a step down. This is inner exile, not being forcibly removed but being subtly displaced. Not erased, but rendered invisible. Present but never quite belonging. And so, many choose to mask, to smile when unamused, to contribute when they'd rather contemplate, to speak not because they have something to say, but because silence feels like guilt. Over time, this quiet distortion becomes permanent. The mask fuses to the face. The system doesn't silence you, it rewrites you. Here lies the silent warning. Society is not neutral to personality. It's engineered, and what it engineers it expects to obey. Stillness becomes defiance, reflection becomes threat, solitude becomes exile. We like to think we live in a world that accepts all temperaments, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. This world doesn't just favor extroversion, it weaponizes it. And it does so in the name of participation, professionalism, and positivity. This isn't about temperament, it's about control. Because a mind that reflects is a mind that questions. And questioning, in any form, is always the first step toward disobedience. The child in the corner of the classroom who's watching instead of speaking, they're not behind. They're ahead. But in a world that values speed over insight, that child becomes the problem. They become a target for correction, for adjustment, for erasure. And what begins as socialization ends as submission. The system doesn't break the introvert. It simply nudges them, one performance at a time, into a shape that will no longer disrupt the flow. But something remains, a tension, buried deep. A memory of how it felt before the mask. A flicker of resistance in the refusal to fully comply. That tension is not failure. It is the soul remembering itself. And the exile is only permanent if you forget the way out. There comes a point where the silence no longer feels protective, where solitude doesn't heal, it haunts, where the mask you wear doesn't just cover your face. It begins to speak for you. At first, it was a defense, a small act of survival. You smiled when you didn't feel like it. You nodded when you disagreed. You spoke when you wanted to listen. Because the world doesn't wait for the thoughtful, it steamrolls them. So, like millions before you, you made a trade. Authenticity for acceptance. Depth for relatability. Truth for comfort. Carl Jung called this mask the persona, not a lie, but a compromise. A version of yourself tailored to be digestible, socially acceptable, safe, but over time, the compromise grows teeth, and the mask no longer obeys you. It starts to whisper, "This is who you are. This is how you fit in. This is how you survive." The introvert, once rooted in reflection, slowly drifts, not outward, but inward, into performance. It doesn't begin with deception. It begins with adaptation. A polished LinkedIn profile, an Instagram grid of curated thoughts, a voice that sounds just intellectual enough, just emotional enough, just safe enough to win approval. But these aren't random behaviors. They're rehearsals. And rehearsal, when repeated, becomes identity. Because in the age of attention, silence is punished. You're told that if you're not posting, you're invisible. If you're not branding yourself, you don't exist. And if you want to be heard, you must perform. The quiet inner world, once a sanctuary, becomes a liability. So you build a persona that's palatable, a digital version of yourself who's always on, always insightful, always controlled. And the real you, the one that thrives in complexity, contradiction, and quiet, it begins to fade, pixel by pixel. What makes this dangerous isn't that the mask is false. It's almost true. It contains fragments of you, your intelligence, your wit, your style. But like any good illusion, it's just accurate enough to keep you from questioning it. And this is the deeper warning. Not that the world misunderstands you, but you may come to misunderstand yourself. The longer you wear the mask, the more comfortable it becomes. The more it's rewarded with likes, praise, promotions, the more you conflate it with identity. Until one day, you wake up in a life you don't recognize, doing work that drains you, surrounded by people who only know the version of you created to survive. You're visible, but unseen, surrounded, but not known. You've become fluent in the language of performance, but illiterate in the language of your own soul. And what's worse, the mask defends itself. Try to remove it, and it will ask, without me, who will you be? This is the internal collapse, the exile that happens not across borders, but within your own mind. The moment when introversion isn't just suppressed, it's reconstructed. No longer a natural rhythm, but a flaw to be fixed, a glitch to be corrected. The pressure no longer comes from outside. It comes from within. From the part of you that has learned to police yourself before anyone else does. From the whisper that says, "Don't be too quiet. Don't be too weird. Don't be too much of yourself." So you moderate your essence. You flatten your edges. You become pleasant, a word that has buried more souls than any weapon ever could. And the price? You forget the sound of your own voice when it isn't trying to impress. You forget what you love when no one's watching. You forget how to be without needing to be seen. The persona becomes the prison. And yet, there's a way back. But first, you must ask, what part of me did I bury to be accepted? And what would happen if I chose to unearth it? Because no mask can truly contain the self. It can only delay its return. And sometimes, the quietest rebellion is remembering who you were before the whisper. There was a time when freedom meant stillness, when the ability to sit alone with your own thoughts wasn't just a habit. It was a kind of spiritual sovereignty, a space untouched by noise, uninterrupted by demand. But that time is gone. Now silence feels dangerous. Empty rooms must be filled. Every pause is padded with music, screens, and scrolling. The mind is never alone, not because it doesn't want to be, but because it's been taught to fear itself when it is. This isn't chaos. Its design, Jean Baudrillard warned us about this, that we would be buried not under censorship, but simulation. A world where reality is replaced with spectacle, where the illusion of freedom is sold through infinite choice. But every choice leads back to the same place, nowhere. And Neil Postman saw the future too. He didn't predict a boot stamping on the human face. He predicted a grin. A society that wouldn't burn books but drown in entertainment. A people not oppressed by fear, but by distraction. We amuse ourselves into forgetfulness, into emptiness, into sleep. And for the introvert, the one who once protected the sacred space of solitude, this is a quiet tragedy. Because even their refuge has been colonized. Their mind, once a fortress of contemplation, is now a marketplace of noise. Pop-ups, notifications, algorithms that never sleep. They don't even call it a distraction anymore. They call it connection, opportunity, freedom. But what kind of freedom demands your constant attention? What kind of liberty leaves you too overstimulated to think, too entertained to feel? Too busy to remember who you are when everything goes silent. This is the new prison. And its bars are made of dopamine and illusion. The introvert, baited by comfort, finds themselves drifting in a digital lotus-eater trap, always consuming, never nourished. Every click is a tiny forgetting. Every scroll is a soft surrender. Solitude has become scarcity. And peace has been priced out, because in a world built on noise, stillness is rebellion, and the most dangerous thing you can do is turn everything off and listen to the quiet that still remembers your name. When the outer world feels deafening, hostile, and manic, the introvert retreats inward. But the question is, to what? Once, the internal world was a sanctuary, a garden behind high walls, tended with reflection, imagination, and careful self-questioning. But as the outside world grows louder and more chaotic, something subtle begins to shift. The garden becomes a bunker. The walls, once protective, become impenetrable. It's here that the echo chamber begins, not just the political echo chambers we warn about, but something quieter, more insidious. The psychological echo chamber of the self. It starts with the need to protect identity, to hold on to a sense of truth in a world saturated with noise and contradiction. But over time, truth is replaced with certainty. Certainty hardens into superiority. And the introvert, once a seeker of depth, slowly becomes a prisoner of self-confirming beliefs. Carl Jung warned us of this danger. He called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. When solitude turns to self-righteousness, when reflection becomes narcissistic insulation, we stop growing. The inner world doesn't stay still, it calcifies. Even intellectuals, especially intellectuals, are vulnerable to this trap, because the more articulate your thoughts, the easier it becomes to justify them. The more insight you possess, the easier it is to use it as a shield instead of a mirror. Self-awareness, unexamined, becomes arrogance, and isolation becomes a throne. In the digital age, this effect multiplies. Algorithms reward not doubt, but conviction. We are pushed into tribes not of geography, but of ideology. Introverts, disillusioned with mainstream noise, often seek alternative perspectives, only to be caught in the same pattern from a different direction. What begins as resistance morphs into identity, and identity, when fused with isolation, becomes fragile. You start to see everyone else as programmed, distracted, blind, and yourself as awake. But this too is a story, a comforting one that whispers to you in solitude. You are different. You are better. It feels like clarity, but it's actually distortion, because true solitude does not whisper ego, it whispers humility. It humbles you before the vastness of reality, reminds you how much you don't know, how easily you can be wrong. When solitude no longer challenges you, it is no longer solitude. It is a delusion. We shout into the cave, and when our own voice whispers back louder, we call it truth. But the real test is this. Can you hear what doesn't sound like you? Can you sit in silence and not fill it with your own ideas? Because once the self becomes an echo chamber, even freedom becomes a mask. And the walls you built to protect yourself become the ones that keep you from yourself. There is a reason silence is no longer sacred. Because in the age of engineered attention, stillness is not just ignored, it is harvested. Beneath the surface of our fractured identities and curated personas lies a design, a structure with purpose. And behind that structure, there are watchers. Not the caricatured villains of dystopian fiction, but architects of influence who understand something critical. Those who withdraw are not without value. They are, in fact, the most valuable of all, precisely because they believe they're not playing the game. Edward Bernays, the father of modern propaganda, once wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. But this manipulation does not require force. It thrives in subtlety, in the illusion of autonomy. Bernays understood what tech giants would perfect a century later, that the most effective control is invisible, and the most effective surveillance doesn't need to listen to your words, it watches your silence. Welcome to surveillance capitalism, a system where data is not just collected, but weaponized. Where your digital retreat is mapped, monetized, and modeled. The articles you read, the videos you linger on, the thoughts you never speak, but that your behavior betrays. It all becomes part of a profile, not to understand you, but to predict you. To sell not just products, but realities. For the introvert, this is the cruel irony. The retreat into the self, once a form of resistance, now becomes a commodity. Your disengagement is not an act of defiance, it is permission. A vacuum, filled not by your voice but by algorithms, and so the system does not need to break you. It only needs to bore you, to lull you, to keep you staring. Like Plato's cave, you are offered shadows, images dancing on a wall. But unlike the ancient parable, there is no one holding chains. You walked in willingly. The watchers don't need to imprison you. They only need to keep you entertained. The platforms reward passivity. The more you scroll without speaking, the more you are profiled without protest. This isn't censorship, it's seduction. And the price of comfort is perception. Even dissent is co-opted. Even reflection becomes a brand. You are not being silenced. You are being watched, mapped, categorized, and most dangerously of all, left alone just long enough to believe you are free, because true oppression no longer looks like boots on the streets. It looks like a quiet room, screens glowing, data flowing, and you, staring back at the wall. They thought your silence meant surrender. But silence, when chosen, is not absence, it is a signal. In a world that feeds on noise, distraction, and digital obedience, the one who can sit with silence has not failed to adapt. They have remembered something everyone else forgot. Something ancient, something dangerous. The system, the watchers, the architects, the endless carnival of curated noise depends on a particular kind of blindness. It feeds on reactions. It profits from confusion. And most of all, it survives by convincing you that meaning can only be found out there, in status, in visibility, in applause. But Viktor Frankl knew otherwise. In the darkest recesses of human suffering, Frankl discovered that even when everything is taken from you, your freedom, your future, even your name, one thing remains: your capacity to choose how you respond. That choice, that inner stance, becomes the final human freedom. And for the introvert, the thinker, the observer, the quiet rebel, this is not a consolation. It is a weapon. The same silence that was twisted into isolation can be turned into resistance. Because when you are no longer distracted, you begin to perceive the design. You begin to think thoughts that were not handed to you. You begin to remember who you were before the mask, before the noise, before the algorithm. Nietzsche warned that when the values of the world collapse, you are not supposed to mourn. You are supposed to create. The danger is not the emptiness. It's forgetting that you can fill it. The modern world punishes contemplation because contemplation is the seed of change. It whispers what the system cannot control. It lets you ask, what if none of this noise is necessary? What if the way forward is not louder, but deeper? This is why the quiet mind is feared. It cannot be baited into conflict, nor seduced by spectacle. It sees what others refuse to see, not because it is better, but because it is still. There is signal beneath the silence, a slow, glowing pulse of awareness that, once rediscovered, cannot be unseen. It is not just a private escape. It is the beginning of a different kind of revolution, one that does not march in the streets or trend on timelines, but unfolds quietly inside the minds of those who refuse to be programmed. And so, the warning becomes something else. Not a call to hide, but a call to reclaim. Not just time or attention, but meaning. Selfhood, consciousness itself. The flame that seemed to flicker in isolation now begins to spread, one silent soul to another. No noise, not a spectacle, but a signal. And it begins in you. In every era, there are those who are overlooked, not because they are unworthy, but because they refuse to shout. They sit at the edge of rooms, not because they are weak, but because they are watching. They speak rarely, not because they lack ideas, but because they understand their weight. And when the world begins to collapse under the volume of its own delusions, it is often the quiet ones who remember how to listen. What society calls passive may, in truth, be patient. What it mocks as timidity may be caution, and what it dismisses as withdrawal may be the necessary silence before creation. There is a reason totalitarian regimes burn books and flood the air with slogans. There is a reason marketing replaces wisdom with attention. There is a reason the contemplative are made to feel defective, because stillness, when cultivated, becomes insight. And insight threatens every shallow system built on manipulation and noise. But the time for passive survival is over. The quiet ones must awaken, not by becoming louder, but by becoming sharper. Not by imitating the noise, but by refining the silence. To be silent in a world that demands reaction is no longer enough. Silence must now become deliberate, discerning, strategic, like the philosopher in the cave who turns away from shadows, not out of despair, but in pursuit of the source. You are not powerless. You are potential energy waiting to be directed. Your mind, undistracted, can cut through illusion. Your solitude, when chosen, can become a forge. And your voice, when finally used, can carry the weight of 1,000 empty slogans. This is not the age of conformity. This is the age of remembering. You do not have to become someone else to be heard. You only have to become who you truly are, and remain unshaken when the world forgets how to listen. The warning has passed. The illusion has been exposed. What remains is a decision. Let your silence rot in the prison they built for you, or refine it into a sword. Because when the quiet ones awaken, the world will not be the same.